Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. On today's episode, we are going to discuss the controversy and debate surrounding zoos. Are zoos vital organizations that promote scientific research and public education and save animals on the verge of extinction? Or are zoos terrible prisons with no educational value that damage animals physically and psychologically? But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram, Thinking in English podcast, or the link is in the description. It's full of great vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar content. And you definitely should look at our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for all transcripts and other bonus content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Controversial. Controversial. Causing disagreement or discussion. For example, that book was very controversial. To struggle. To struggle. To experience difficulty and make a very great effort in order to do something. For instance, I've been struggling to understand this article all afternoon. Logistically. Logistically. In a way that involves the careful organization of a complicated activity. For instance, in theory, this is a great idea, but logistically, it's a nightmare. Aristocrat. Aristocrat. An aristocrat is a person of high social rank who belongs to the aristocracy of a country. For example, many aristocrats were killed in the French Revolution. Conservation. Conservation. Conservation is the protection of plants, animals, and natural areas from the damaging effects of human activity. Wildlife conservation is an important idea in a number of African countries. Biodiversity. Biodiversity. This is the number and types of plants and animals that exist in a particular area of the world, and the problems of protecting this. For example, much of this area's biodiversity is threatened by climate change. Captive. Captive. When talking about a person or animal, captive means having limited ability to move or act freely because of being kept in a space. For example, if it is successful, releasing captive animals into the wild could restore the population to over 500 this year. Habitat. Habitat. The natural environment in which an animal or plant usually lives. With so many areas of forest being cut down, a lot of wildlife is losing its natural habitat. And finally, detrimental. Detrimental. If something is detrimental, it causes harm or damage. For example, some chemicals have a detrimental impact on the environment. As I'm sure you can all guess from the name of this podcast, one of the things I really want to encourage you all to do is to think in English. More specifically, I want you all to think critically, to analyze different possibilities, to consider all sides of a debate, and to then express your own opinions, which will help you master the English language. For that reason, a number of previous episodes have focused on controversial issues or debates, including free university and assisted suicide, and presented two sides of the argument. My idea is that you will be able to make your own decisions about the issue and hopefully think using English. So, why am I mentioning this? Well, today's episode will be another episode in this style. Over the last few months, I have read various articles about the impact of coronavirus on zoos, animal centers, and wildlife safari parks. Without paying customers willing or able to visit such attractions, many of these businesses have struggled financially and logistically to look after their animals. Calgary Zoo in Canada, for instance, has been forced to return their pandas to China because of a bamboo shortage in the country. Pandas only eat fresh bamboo. This was no problem before coronavirus, as the zoo could easily import bamboo from China. But the ongoing pandemic has grounded most flights and left the zoo struggling to feed their animals. After reading this story and other similar stories, for instance, a zoo in the UK is having to relocate for financial reasons, it led me to consider the debate surrounding zoos. Simply put, should zoos exist? Zoos actually have a very long history. In fact, records suggest that over 4,000 years ago, aristocrats were keeping animals such as giraffes, bears, and dolphins in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Tiergarten Schönbrunn, apologies for my pronunciation, in Austria, is the oldest zoo in the world that is still operational. It opened in 1752. There is also a long history of controversy surrounding zoos. In the past, American zoos actually displayed humans captured from remote tribes. And zookeepers all around the world had no idea what to feed animals. The modern debate around zoos often focuses on animal welfare, whether zoos protect animals or whether they imprison them. Are zoos vital organizations because they promote scientific research and public education and save animals on the verge of extinction? Or are zoos terrible prisons with no educational value that damage animals physically and psychologically? The rest of this episode will present both sides of the argument. Let's start with education. On one side of the argument, supporters argue that zoos educate the public about animals and conservation efforts. In the USA, zoos attract over 181 million visitors every year, which is more than the combined spectators of most major sports in the country. Zoos can potentially increase visitors' knowledge of biodiversity and the ways to protect such biodiversity. Zoos allow people to see incredible animals in person and hopefully leave feeling an attachment to those animals. People won't take steps to preserve what they don't love, and they can't love something they don't know. On the other side of the argument, opponents argue that zoos don't educate the public enough to justify keeping animals captive. There is no real evidence to suggest zoos and aquariums actually change people's attitudes towards animals or interest in conservation. TV shows, including anything by the British TV legend David Attenborough, bring high quality pictures of animals in their natural habitat into our living rooms without harming or imprisoning any creature. Despite this, supporters of zoos claim zoos produce helpful scientific research. In fact, accredited zoos in America published 5,175 peer-reviewed scientific papers between 1993 and 2013. According to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, in 2017, 173 accredited zoos spent $25 million on research, studied 485 types of animals, worked on 1,280 research products, and published 170 research papers. In the past, zoos have been useful in researching animal to animal and animal to human disease transmission. Furthermore, it has been suggested that zoos save species from extinction and other dangers. According to an article written by the Taronga Conservation Society in Australia, corroboree frogs, eastern bongos, regent honeyeaters, Panamanian golden frogs, Bellinger River snapping turtles, golden lion tamarins, and Amur leopards, among others, have all been saved from extinction by zoos. They are also contributing to saving polar bears, tigers, wild African elephants from habitat loss, apes and rhinos from poachers, dolphins and whales from hunters, and bees and butterflies from declining populations. By keeping large populations of animals and eventually repopulating some into the wild, zoos could help preserve species in danger from climate change and human-made extinction. Repopulation has actually worked in the past. The last truly wild horses were declared extinct in the wild in the 1960s, when only 12 were left living in zoos. By 2018, breeding programs at zoos increased that number to 2,400 horses, with 800 being reintroduced into the wild. Nevertheless, these benefits are not enough for opponents of zoos. Instead, they argue that zoos are detrimental to both animals' physical and psychological well-being. Zoo enclosures are often too small for the animals to carry out their normal routines, which can lead to many problems. About 70% of adult male gorillas in North America have heart disease, the leading cause of death among gorillas in captivity, although this condition is almost completely absent in the wild. Only captive gorillas have heart disease. In addition, captive elephants only live about half as long as wild elephants. Animals also experience psychological issues, including depression and anxiety, due to smaller enclosures, changes in diet and activities, and the introduction of things not seen in the wild, such as medical exams and people with cameras. Moreover, as a result of the 2013 documentary Blackfish, which demonstrated the psychological damage done to orcas by the SeaWorld theme park, California outlawed orca breeding. So here is today's final thought. This episode of Thinking in English has looked at the controversy and debate surrounding zoos. On the one hand, zoos are said to save vulnerable animals from extinction, promote scientific research, and educate the public about animals and conservation. On the other hand, zoos are often criticized for harming animals and not actually performing any worthwhile education. Personally, I lean towards the anti-zoo argument. Of course, I have visited zoos and aquariums in the past. However, the most recent few times I have done so have left me incredibly uncomfortable. I specifically remember looking at sea lions in the Osaka aquarium about 4 years ago and feeling terrible about their small enclosures and unsatisfying life. What about you? What are your opinions on zoos? Has this episode changed or reinforced your opinions? Do you think it's better to leave animals in their natural habitat or to keep them in zoos? Here are today's comprehension questions. As always, the written questions and answers are available in the description of the podcast and also on our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Why was Calgary Zoo in Canada struggling to feed its pandas? Where is the world's oldest operational zoo? What is the leading cause of death in gorillas in captivity? Thank you for listening to today's episode of Thinking in English. Please share with your friends, check out our social media links in the description, and send us a message. We really appreciate all of your feedback. If you have any ideas for topics, future podcast guests, or other learning formats, please let us know. And please leave us a rating. We're now on Instagram. I'm producing daily content focusing on improving your vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation, so make sure you check out the Thinking in English page. Thinking in English podcast on Instagram, or the link is in the description. Instagram is also probably the best way to contact me. All transcripts of the podcast are now available on the Thinking in English blog. Vocabulary lists, comprehension questions, and articles are all there for you to read, as well as some extra bonus content. The link is in the description, so please check it out. Thank you, and see you next time.